Today we reaffirm our determination to work with our sisters and brothers across the continent to realize the African Union's vision of Agenda 2063, to build the Africa that all Africans want, to forge a free trade area that stretches from Cape Town to Cairo, bringing growth and opportunity to all African countries, to silence the guns and let peace and harmony reign. Today, we declare that our progress as South Africa in all our endeavors depends on and cannot be separated from the onward march of our beloved continent, Africa. Let us forge a compact, not merely as business and labor, not as those who govern and those who are governed, but as citizens and patriots of this great nation, free and equal and resolute. Let us forge a compact for growth and economic opportunity, for productive lands and viable communities, for knowledge, innovation, and for services that are affordable, accessible, and sustainable. Let us also forge a compact of an efficient, capable, and ethical state, a state that is free from corruption, for companies that generate social value and propel human development, and for elected officials and public servants who faithfully serve no other cause than the cause of our people.
Of course, in attendance today, heads of state from across Africa and former presidents of South Africa. Thabo Mbeki was given a rousing welcome, but FW De Klerk was not. To discuss the nuances of today's event, we're joined by Director of Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick. Great to have you with us,
Good
Angelo. Firstly, let's start with President Ramaphosa as a politician. So he wasn't a shoo-in at Nasrec. We didn't know what was going to happen. There's been a lot of talk of factionalism since. Today, did this seem like a consolidation of power?
Or a step in the process of consolidation. So the long journey that we've travelled since, what was it, December 2017, to this election of him as president, is, I think, one of the first couple of steps that will lead to his consolidation after the inauguration is finished, the cabinet is announced, and presumably to the second term that he is going to be looking at as elected president. And so this is, I think, just maybe a third of the way through, because there's much work to be done. He keeps mentioning that he wants an ethical state that is free of corruption. That's going to be his big test, because if he wants that to be his legacy, the undoing of things that had gone wrong over the last 8 years, that's going to be a steep curve, because it isn't just about people inside his party, it's about people inside various spheres of government who are not quietly going to go off into the sunset.
Well, talking about people inside the party, Jesse Duarte was talking about symbolism, Willem involved. What's the symbolism of their involvement today?
So this is statecraft at a very specific and sophisticated order. This is about not just signalling a party victory, but this is signalling the establishment of a particular vision of the state. So one can listen to that speech that was given as a keynote speech for what we can imagine and what we should hold the president accountable for. Involving the Deputy Secretary General is both statecraft at the level of invoking her role as a former ambassador.
She hasn't always been seen to be on his side.
Precisely, but in calling her ambassador on that program, it is to invoke her in her role as a former, shall we say, representative of the state, not just as a figure inside the party. To take the former Speaker of Parliament is to take somebody as a kind of continuity, handover figure who used to run Parliament, is now doing this kind of thing, and somebody who's also a senior figure in the ANC, but also that idea that it's no longer just about the party, that this is an event for public consumption, to move it away from the union buildings into Loftus Versfeld, to move it into the city, to have the space that is on Africa Day a signal that this is his presidency, not just for South Africa. Much of this, of course, is open to being critiqued, and one must. But if there's a lesson we've learned from the last 8 years, it is that it is important to have critical voices that are open to interrogating the actions of actors of state and government, not just accept them and celebrate them.
Was it very different for you, the tangible difference of being in a big stadium as opposed to the Union buildings, which seems very exclusive when you go there? Yeah.
So the Union buildings, there would have been other kinds of dynamics about getting people from the ordinary public involved, because fewer seats, smaller space, because even though it looks quite large on some television screens, for those of us who've been lucky to be able to just visit, it is quite a intimate space in some respects. But also importantly, I think this is a moment in which there are things that I see as continuity. So there are things that those of us who are not particularly interested in military fanfare see this approach of kind of the usual of flags and having military aircraft flying over, the presence of the military as a traditional figure of the relationship between political authority and military authority in South Africa being reaffirmed, reiterated. And in some other respects, a slightly different tone, a tone of accountability or opening oneself up to accountability, which I think is going to be Mr. Ramaphosa's big test, whether he can build up a substance behind the rhetoric of accountability and clean governance.
So I can't believe you don't love the fighter jets. I do, and I found it interesting that there was sort of an educational element about these are the planes we have. We have the first black female in front of this formation. So a chance for South Africans to be proud. I haven't seen that before at an inauguration.
Well, it's a reminder using those mechanisms of what somebody like Michael Billig would call a form of nationalism, which is that you get people to buy in and to have pride in all sorts of things. And that's important in some respects if you want to build the kind of consensus that Mr. Ramaphosa wants to build. But beyond that symbolism, beyond the fanfare and the marches and the very nice uniforms and everything working on time, people are going to wake up on Monday morning and would want to begin to feel a difference as the first day of the sixth administration going into full gear. And that, I think, this is an interesting, nice day, but at the same time, people will want more. And some of that more is that you have the national carrier, South African Airways, in severe trouble flying over. So there is an attempt to construct continuity with Mandela's inauguration 25 years ago. But much has gone wrong that many people will on Monday morning want us to return to. Great as the party is, great as the fanfare is, I think people do want substance.
Yeah, I was thinking, can they afford to be doing this? There's so much trouble. What about Cyril Ramaphosa's performance today? So he's an intellectual, but I think he speaks more simply than Thabo Mbeki. I don't know if you agree. And he was dancing. He's not a Jacob Zuma, but he was among those performers. Is he looking for a balance, kind of being the statesman and the man of the people, do you think?
My sense of reading the kind of semiotics, the signs, the symbolism of what Mr. Ramaphosa's work has been since he first came into the office in that Valentine's Day transition in 2018, and looking at his performance today, is that there is an attempt to bring in some of the old, the valuable of the past, so those echoes with the Mandela, the Mbeki presidencies, and also to stamp his own, shall we say, image on this particular administration. So what he's done is he's indicated, as has the party that has elected him into that position, that they wish to take a new direction. That new direction is clean governance, it is an end to corruption, it is the delivery of the things that he's mentioned. But what I think many South Africans are going to be looking for is how much of that trickles down into the spaces where they experience government. So this happens at, whether it is in the policing services, so whether people, in places like Cape Town who take selfies on benches at beachfronts experience a different kind of policing over the next 5 years, and how soon that kicks in, whether people find that they no longer have to go to schools to collect the bodies of their children who died in pit latrines, whether women experience a greater sense of safety, whether they experience greater accountability, whether people who say that service delivery has been compromised by these particular officials' misconduct see those officials pay the price of their misconduct or whether they get protected by the party as loyal cadres. These are going to be the tests of Mr. Ramaphosa's administration in the very next couple of weeks. People are not going to wait a year to start saying, I'm not feeling the change. They're going to start looking for the change immediately, and that's tough because the change doesn't arrive on Monday morning.
Why? Because he's been in office for a year more.
But he's, remember, he had inherited a cabinet configuration that was that of the administration that he inherited. This is now his opportunity to do all of the things that he said he would do if he became president, because what he has is a mandate of having been voted in by Parliament on a victory for his party that he led to 57%. He might want to argue to that party that without his intervention and the intervention of his people, they may have scored lower. Some inside his party would argue that had they gone a different direction, they may have scored higher. That debate is not going to end in the ANC tomorrow, next week, or the week after. But the test for Mr. Ramaphosa will be how he uses his position as head of state and head of government to, one, construct a cabinet that's leaner and meaner, construct administrative accountability in that cabinet, and force ministers to go to Parliament and answer questions in ways that we haven't really seen in this country, because these are new times. We have new challenges. It's not a return to the 1990s. We can't afford that. Then we were building under a government of national unity, hope, and all sorts of other things. We can't build hope anymore. We now need to build and deliver. And that's what I think 58 million people want from Mr. Ramaphosa.
And he set it up. So he didn't use New Dawn, I think New Era. So he keeps on using that rhetoric.
Right, because people want to hear a direction that they're going to watch for as citizens. They don't want public relations. They don't want ordinary speeches. We've heard from ordinary people who protest, the community protest, the service delivery protest. They're not about hearing more words from politicians. They want delivery and action. And some of that action is the delivery of things that they have demanded and feel and have constitutional guarantees that they have the right to. Safety of their children, good education. Others that they've been told they've been told for 25 years they should dream of a better South Africa and should work towards it. Jobs, employment, better higher education, better life chances, reintegration of our spatial dynamics that have gone wrong under colonialism and apartheid, equal chances for people who've been left out of the so-called miracle of 1994. Tough ask. Really, really big. And Mr. Ramaphosa and his administration, people around him have set themselves this test and this task, and that is what citizens are going to judge them for.
And even he says people want more than words, but let's quickly touch on the speech. I mean, what did you think of it? And a strong focus on Africa being the source of humanity, that we can't achieve things without our African brothers and sisters.
So again, if one goes back, a few decades, it's Thabo Mbeki's I Am an African speech. I think it was strategic to choose to inaugurate South Africa's 6th administration on Africa Day, to remind all of us that this is a country in Africa. And for some people, that is nothing but lack and disaster and doom. And that's a view of ignorance, that this is a continent with severe problems, many of those problems created by people outside the continent. Many of those problems exacerbated by people on the continent behaving irresponsibly. If we are to take Mr. Ramaphosa seriously and see this new change in Africa, it is incumbent, and he reminds us of this, that it is incumbent on all who live here to not just work together to make this society work, but to work together to hold the society's politicians accountable. So we must learn from what has gone wrong over the last 25 years and augur in a new kind of way of being citizens. That it is not just that government is going to do for us, it is that when government does not do, what are the appropriate channels? And here I think middle-class South Africans can learn from ordinary South Africans who have walked this path, who have done the work, approaching government, approaching officials, going through the channels, and when they failed, taking to the streets. And here I think it is time for us to stand with people who have been doing this for 25 years and to use our privilege as middle-class subjects, our access to certain kinds of resources, to insist, because in South Africa, as in the world, it's all of us together or none of us at all.
Yeah. FW De Klerk, let's talk about the reception of different leaders. Do you think his stature has diminished as time has gone by? I mean, he was booed today. Young South Africans sort of revisiting the past and saying,
So that is, I think, one of the sets of, to use Terry Bell and Dumiza Ntsibeza's phrase, unfinished business. That how FW De Klerk is constructed by South Africa has shifted, principally because we're now a majority young country, and many people have not accepted the ways in which Mr. De Klerk has figured himself and has been figured. And some of this has to do...
Do you think he has not been humble?
I wouldn't say that it is a question of humility. I think for many, many people it is a question of accountability, that they have unanswered questions from apartheid and late apartheid period, that period between 1990 and 1994, around questions of the Bishu event, questions of what happened to children in Maseru, questions of what was known and what was not known. Mr. De Klerk has at several occasions said that he had no knowledge of such things, but there are very many people who don't fully take him at his word and don't believe him. And there is some sense in which I think that unfinished business of the last apartheid head of state having, as many people say, gotten off scot-free and having been given a Nobel Prize, that sits very oddly with people who look back at that history and feel that they don't have answers. And we, I think, live in a country that, though 25 years have passed by, precisely because we remain the most unequal society on earth, that life chances for many poor people have not necessarily improved in economic terms, that paper freedoms that are guaranteed on constitutional, means and measures have not necessarily worked out for them. And we see this in the indices of research about who has life chances to get a job and who does not, who's more likely to get a better quality education and why. And so those things rankle at people. And so when Mr. De Klerk, as he sometimes does, makes public remarks, he's being judged in terms of what they see as his unaccountability, but they also judge that they ask whether he really has the moral authority to make the kinds of statements that he does, principally because he happened to be next to somebody like Nelson Mandela at a particular moment in history, and even somebody like J.M. Coetzee in his obituary, his remarks on Nelson Mandela after his death, drew a distinction between the two figures, principally because of the ways in which that worked. He spoke of Mr. Mandela as one, perhaps the last great man of history, and Mr. De Klerk already then in 1993 had a slightly diminished stature next to Mandela, and by the time of Mandela's death certainly there was a reduction of stature, principally because you cannot stand next to Mr. Mandela and not be in his shadow.
And you've made me think of something, that he has set himself up as someone who can critique our subsequent governments and presidents, so that causing an issue. And
do so in public. And for some people there is an odd disjuncture between having presided over the last government that was the government of a crime against humanity, and then critiquing. And one thinks here of a similar figure like Mikhail Gorbachev, for whom it took a much longer time to start critiquing the governments that succeeded him in the disbanded Soviet Union, and did so with slightly more muted approaches. And in South Africa, this was not just about a crime from the past, which was the totalitarian USSR for Russians and Belarusians, but in South Africa it was a minority white supremacist government over a majority black, and Mr. De Klerk, having been seen as the last face of that government, now taking in a position in post-apartheid South Africa of critiquing that many people take issue with, particularly also because they feel he hasn't fully accounted for, and it's not just black South Africans, there are very many white South Africans who feel that they paid the price as the ordinary foot soldiers of apartheid, and no one in leadership has taken similar responsibility.
Has been fully honest. Somebody else may be forgiven then for AIDS denialism, a rousing welcome for Thabo Mbeki.
Quite, and let's not forget there was a time when Mr. Mbeki was not quite so popular inside the ANC, or as among ordinary South Africans. But this, I think, is also, it speaks to mismemory and forgetting and erasure, and what is the passage of history. We all forget the past, or we remember it as having been better than or worse than it was. And so for some of us, it is not useful to look back. And there are many, many good things about the Mbeki administration, but there were also many terrible things, as there will be of this administration. Of this sixth administration that we're heading into, when we look back at it, there will be very many important things that will have shifted, hopefully around corruption. But it may be that in some senses the historians of the second half of the century will ask very critical questions, and the young people who will then scrabbling out their life in the second half of the century in a world changed because of climate shifts, climate emergency, might have all sorts of critiques of this administration and what it did and didn't do to make life better for them when they're in their 60s and 70s.
All right, another former president, conspicuous by his absence, again, former President Jacob Zuma. What do you make of him saying he's very busy trying to stay out of prison?
These are the rhetorical battles that I think Jacob Zuma has been sort of, how does one put this? He's been kind of, blowing off his salvo over the bow for the last couple of months. It is, I think, a symbolic gesture on his part to distance himself from while critiquing. And he has done similar things on his social media platforms or social media platform accounts that speak in his name. And so it is slightly surprising that he would have gone this far to create this dialectic distance between himself and the sixth administration. But it could also be that, one does not know what happens behind the scenes, that he holds the sixth administration responsible for whatever happens to him now that the state organs are aligning in order to have a justice interrupted complete itself. So the idea that the former president may have to stand up to charges in court, and despite all of his arguments that the process will continue, because that is the nature of an administrative state, that I think might rile at him and at many of his supporters, and they may lay the blame at the foot of the sixth administration.
Well, what you're saying makes sense, because he recently said that it was this administration that decided that he should pay for his court cases. It was actually a court. But that seems to be very open blaming.
Yes, and it's rhetoric that is not backed up by substance. So South Africa has a government that has three arms. It is the executive, of which he was the head, and Mr. Ramaphosa will now be the head once he announces his cabinet. It is the legislature, which is the parliamentarians who have to do their job, and it's the judiciary. And the judiciary has been fighting for its independence for a very long time, and it's an independence that must be protected. This idea that the judiciary, the judges, are in the service of the administration is actually, deeply disturbing, because we have had judgment after judgment against the executive from that judiciary. And the test will be for the sixth administration whether they respond differently to those judgments than their predecessors did. And so Mr. Ramaphosa and his cabinet members, their first tests will be, should courts begin to find against them, whether they continue to challenge those court judgments or whether they implement the judicial findings and improve the administrative efficiency that they say they desire in the state. And Mr. Zuma seems to have a very different reading of the relationship between the executive and the judiciary, because it sort of slides them one into the other by suggesting that it is the administration, executive, that found that he must pay for his own legal costs rather than the judiciary implementing and establishing the point of law.
Yeah. So there's been speculation that he will try and challenge President Ramaphosa at some point, maybe setting himself up, maybe aligning with other political parties. Does this look like the beginning of something? It seems more open to me, very pointed to say that he's busy trying to stay out of jail today.
It would surprise me if Mr. Zuma joined a different political, formation. My sense was that
even within the party,
that he was always going to be a loyal member of the African National Congress, that there are long-standing relations between him and various members. The test will be whether he does this inside the ANC, and should it fail, what the ANC's test, and whether it chooses the organization's unity and survival over an individual's desires and needs, which has always been the organization's ethos, that it always said it chooses the organization over the individual. All of its former presidents have always said, the famous light-hearted remark that Mr. Mandela made was that when he gets to heaven, the first thing he's going to do is ask where the ANC branch is. But this idea that an organization supersedes the desires, needs, and even the emergencies of an individual is a long-standing tradition. And the test of the party will be whether it chooses to go that route, or whether it chooses to split itself over the figure of an individual. Its history in the recent past around splitting over individuals has not been a good history. So let's not forget that one of the parties that split off over the leadership issue around Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma is in such dire straits in its last parliamentary performance in this election that, the phrase, "it's cold outside the ANC" comes to mind. It's very difficult to sustain that kind of long-term trajectory.
And there has been analysis that Ramaphosa's actions seem to be aimed at avoiding being the man that causes that split. Last question on Zuma. Will this distance, however, make things a little bit easier for the president, because there did seem to be this tension before the elections. He was at a rally talking about the new era, about a change from the past, while former President Zuma was rallying for the party in Durban. So it seemed that there was this possibly unsustainable tension.
Well, I think it has to do with the difference between a national politician and what is Mr. Zuma may be becoming a regional politician. And so his foothold in KwaZulu-Natal is quite strong, and it's not for sort of ethno-nationalist reasons. It's simply because he is from the area and has a network there. And as president of the party and president of the state, he had a national network. As Mr. Ramaphosa begins to do the work of president of the country and doing the so-called cleanup and realigning and changing who is in cabinet and what happens at provincial levels, all sorts of shifts in the state will result in shifts in the party, all sorts of shifts in the party will result in shifts in the state. This is not going to happen overnight, but with a strengthened National Directorate of Public Prosecutions, with priority crimes division, new appointments, with IPID presumably strengthening, with a shift in the size and composition of the cabinet, I think South Africans have some hope. The test for Mr. Ramaphosa and for the South Africans who have hope in him is whether they can do the necessary work as citizens to hold him accountable, to insist that his words get translated into actions, and to stand by their constitutional rights and not reduce it to a kind of sporting competition between two men. One a hero, one a villain, whichever is on which side you are, happens to be your hero and the other one is a villain. That is not how South Africa will, shift itself into the next phase. It will require of us to learn what went wrong in the previous administration and not repeat it in this administration. Adulation of personality, choosing the man over the country, over the movement, over the necessity of delivering equality to all of us, that is not a recipe for a good developmental state.
All right, so we don't have much time, but we have to talk about the cabinet.
Right.
Firstly, do you think the people know if they're in or out?
I think conversations will have started. I think those conversations will have started at party level inside the NEC with Mr. Ramaphosa and all of his people in research and in the background. I think the push is for a reduced sized cabinet, but also for a prioritizing of certain functions in that cabinet. And there will have to be trade-offs, because he is not, the emperor, king. He is the president of the country by virtue of being president of a party to whom he remains accountable. And so whatever tensions are in that party will also work itself out in the way in which he chooses. Now, people have said that he's a weakened figure. All I've seen over the last 18 months or so is a man moving into a stronger and stronger position, and it is precisely that moving into the stronger and stronger position that from a previous administration we have to learn. It's not that we want a weak president, but we want one who, despite his strengths, will be accountable to us.
Yeah.
And holding him accountable is not about hero worshipping and simply propagandizing any statement that he makes, but to take that statement, that action, and to put it under critical scrutiny, and not to dismiss it, but to engage it. That is the duty of 58 million citizens in this country.
Who will the key figures be in the cabinet? Give us your prediction.
Key figures will be Ministry of Finance. Key figures will be...
Does Tito Mboweni stay or go?
I don't know. Mr. Mboweni is best placed to answer that question, whether he got an SMS saying, pack your bag, or whether he was told you can order in new suits. Education, whether it is one or two ministries, and then, whether that particular minister then proceeds to do what is necessary. Naledi Pandor is mentioned. And then there's also stuff around science and technology, because it has to do with innovation and changing the economy. And then environment, because we're facing a climate crisis in the world, and questions around energy and environment will have to speak to one another, because we cannot continue to do what we've done over the last 25 years. The children who are alive today are the only ones who are going to live into the second half of the century. There are real consequences if we create a world that is so climate unstable that they look back at us and say, and curse us for the decisions that we've made.
I agree. Thank you. Great analysis as always. Auwal Economic Research Institute Director Angelo Fick.